Yes, I agree. That's me. Thank you.
It's on, all right. Hi, hello everyone. My name is George Dimitropoulos. I'm a professor of law at HBKU College of Law. And I'm really delighted to be chairing this panel on digital sovereignty and economic regulation, navigating the future of global governance. I would like to extend my warm thanks to the American Society of International Law, the organizers, of course, of this year's conference, Shubha Sastry and Marcus Levy, for putting together this really fantastic panel. Now, you know, I'm going to go straight to the point here, after having given a little introduction about our fellow panelists as well. We have a wonderful panel, fantastic panelists, and a really important topic. Now, as a matter of introduction to our panel, broadly speaking, there are three ways to regulate the internet and the digital economy. First, through actor self-regulation. Now, this is a dream of the tech community in a way, as well as some academics, obviously. So people have imagined such bodies of law as the Lex Informatica, the Lex Cryptographia, and so on. But of course, you know, sometimes this leads to a nightmare of regulatory capture. Now, you know, obviously governments all over the world have claimed or reclaimed the digital space through the regulation of the internet and the digital economy through such measures as data localization requirements, source code disclosure requirements, and so on. In this way, they are asserting their sovereignty, their digital sovereignty, hence, you know, the title of our panel. Now, international law has been trying to, you know, find its own way in this, you know, binary relationship between self-regulation on the one side and government regulation or state regulation on the other. And there are responses at the multilateral level, at the regional level, at the plurilateral level. Obviously, most recently, you know, last September, the UN Global Digital Compact, September of 2024. So we're going to try to explore all those layers of regulation of the internet as well as the digital economy with a wonderful panel, really. With us today, we have Brian Egan, who is a partner at Skadden and advises on complex legal issues, including national security, export controls, and economic sanctions. And obviously, Brian previously served as a senior legal official in the Obama administration. We have Danielle Osler, who is the Public Policy and Government Relations Counsel at Google. Mark Wu, who is the Henry L. Stimson Professor at Harvard Law School and specializes in international trade, as well as obviously digital governance, as well as, unfortunately, only online with us, Julia Pohle, who is the head of the research group on the politics of digitalization at the Berlin Social Science Center. So welcome. Today, and we have decided, in fact, to divide our panel along three themes. Theme number one, we're going to first explore different regulatory models of the internet and the digital economy. Number two, we will discuss the potential for convergence of the different models. And number three, we will close with a conversation on the prospects of international cooperation. So let's start with the first round of questions to our panel. So we've structured the conversation, we structured the panel along the lines of conversation amongst all of us. So the first round of questions regarding the regulatory models. Now, let's start with the US approach, and maybe that's a question for Mark as well as Brian. So let us try to get a sense of the US approach to economic regulation and digital sovereignty. Would you like to give us an account of the recent US developments in regulating digital technologies, including on outbound investment, US export controls, and others? So are they likely to become global templates or spark further regulatory divergence? And now we may want to bring into the conversation what Vice President Vance said during the AI Action Summit, namely that excessive regulation of the AI sector could kill a transformative industry just as it is taken off, right? And he hinted towards potentially move towards a greater deregulation in the field. Brian, Mark, who would like to go first?
All right. Well, thank you, George, and thank you to the organizers for putting all of this together. I'll get us started as the academic, but I'm sure Brian will actually fill in the real details here. So I think one thing to be aware of is that the U.S. approach has changed dramatically over the last decade. If we looked a decade ago, I think the U.S. was trying to push forward on what we might categorize as a digital liberalization, a type of digital convergence. And on the opposite side of that, you had China pushing for digital sovereignty, including its closed internet, but you also had Europe heavily regulating this according to its norms and trying to push that forward through what we refer to as the Brussels effect. I think over the last decade, a number of geopolitical, economic, as well as technological developments have caused the U.S. to shift its position, and such that while internally, I think how the U.S. is thinking about regulating AI and other internal elements is still evolving. When we look externally at what the U.S. is doing in international law, the U.S. is being much more proactive about using the wide range of economic statecraft tools. That includes, as you mentioned, export controls. It also includes controls on both foreign investment inward, as well as now increasingly controls on examining outward investment. It also includes the use of entities, lists, sanctions, and so forth to shape the terrain here. And that's particularly with regards to emerging technologies targeted towards foreign adversaries. And while there's a number of countries that fit into that category, I think the People's Republic of China is certainly top of mind when it comes to shaping those types of policies. So maybe I'll start there by sort of giving that framework, and I'll let Brian sort of fill in then some more of these details.
Thank you, Mark.
Great, thanks, Mark, and thanks for everyone for being here. I think just to think about our current administration in the U.S. government, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and in so many areas you see divergence. I think this may be one of the few areas where you see more convergence than divergence. In the Biden administration really doubled down on regulating the U.S. technology sector in a lot of really novel ways. And if anything, the Trump administration has signaled that they're going to go even farther. So let me just walk through a few of the highlights really from the last 6 months in U.S. law. On October 28th, 2024, the U.S. government for the first time regulated outbound investments by U.S. investors in technology companies in China, AI, semiconductors, quantum technology companies, defined relatively broadly under the theory that these investments by the U.S. were harming U.S. national security. Trump administration has said, we're going to extend those restrictions even farther. January 8th of this year, the Justice Department put out a rule on sensitive personal data that restricts transmissions of sensitive personal data, again, with a focus on China in many different contexts. There's no indication that the Trump administration is going to pull back from that rule. January 14th, right before the end of the last administration, the Commerce Department came out with a rule on what they call ICTS, Information, Communications, and Technologies, that restricts inputs from Russia and China into the U.S. connected vehicle system. So any kind of smart car on the road today, there are now restrictions on place in terms of inputs, software and hardware from China mostly, and also from Russia. The Trump administration has said, we are going to expand those restrictions. And then finally, and maybe most significantly, on January 15th, the Commerce Department came out with a new set of export controls regulating artificial intelligence, both GPUs, the main processing chips that are used to develop large AI models, and then also the AI models themselves. The code, the algorithms developed are now subject to U.S. export controls for the first time. We don't know where the Trump administration is going to come out on that rule, although so far they've been implementing it, and there's no sign they're going to try to pull that back. So there's been a lot of development in this space in a pretty short period of time.
Right. Thank you very much to both. And let us move to the other side of the Atlantic, namely, let's discuss a little the EU approach to economic governance and digital sovereignty. And I'm going to go to Julia. Julia, thank you so much for joining us online. So the EU has developed a very pronounced digital sovereignty strategy, right? So my question to you is, what are the objectives, the motivations, or the key drivers, if you wish? Is it mostly about developing the internal market, promoting some sort of a digital economy, or is it rather a protectionist agenda? And as it is often criticized by US actors as well as others. So, and how do instruments like the Digital Services Act, the AI Act, the Digital Market Act reflect or challenge, potential global governance models? Julia?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and let me join remotely for this panel. I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person. Well, speaking about European digital sovereignty, I also speak from an academic position. So unfortunately, I don't have a European lawyer sitting next to me to fill in the blanks, but I'll try my best. I've been working on digital sovereignty for quite a while, and I think the debate we have in Europe on digital sovereignty is much more complex than it's often seen from outside. So it's not simply an economic or protectionist agenda. Also, economic concerns, I would say, are really kind of at the heart of it and are one of the main drivers, but it's not all of it. So I would say if you really try to kind of pin down what Europe, the European Union, the European Commission in particular is trying to do under the label of digital sovereignty, it is really they try to, what they say, to strengthen self-determination. So they want to kind of strengthen their capacity of Europe to shape the digital trajectory of Europe in some way, to have kind of strengthened the capacity to act, to set their own rules, like EU own rules, and also a kind of strengthen the capacity to choose between different services, between different technology offers, and so on. So to understand what it actually means and where this comes from is like, I think we need to kind of look back where this digital sovereignty debate is coming from in Europe. And there are some kind of key events that really kind of drove this agenda or like put the idea of digital sovereignty on the agenda. And I think the first one, which is really kind of very obviously when it really all started, is the Snowden revelations. And then it was also kind of increased to the Cambridge Analytica scandal we had around the last election of President Trump and the Brexit referendum. And then there's also this kind of very deep unease among European policymakers and among European citizens about the current logic of the platform economy and the digital economy in general. And so what came up kind of, especially after the Snowden revelations, but also over the years after that, was really calls for kind of we need more independence and we need more control over our own digital infrastructures and over the data flows over these infrastructures. So I would say the first main driver for digital sovereignty calls in Europe is actually our security concerns, are not necessarily economic concerns. It's really about security concerns as one of the main drivers at the very beginning. Economic concerns came in later, I would say, right? That was about like the realization that there is this platform economy going on and Europe companies play a very little role in it, and that Europe has very small or very few instruments to actually encounter the distribution of power that we have in this kind of digital economy that we have. And then I think one of the last drivers, which is something that is often overlooked from outside, also I think Mark already mentioned it, is that actually one of the main ambitions behind the European digital sovereignty idea is that it is a normative and regulatory strategy, and normative in a double sense. So it's in one way, it's kind of a rule-based strategy, but it's also a value-based strategy. So digital sovereignty has kind of developed into this very high ambition that we need to shape a digital transformation in which our security interests and our economic interests are preserved. And that way we need a digital transformation that is based on European values, that's the wording, and that is human-centered. And that we need a strategy kind of to preserve these values also in a global digital economy. So in some way, digital sovereignty now, if you look at what European policymakers are saying, it really becomes this shortcut of if we preserve our digital sovereignty, we actually preserve our European values and we preserve our democratic values. And I personally believe it's very problematic to kind of link these two ideas together. But that's what you see. And that's also what you see underlying the recent kind of regulation that we have, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, the Data Governance Act. They all are some kind of hybrid policies. They combine economic concerns, human rights and user rights concerns, and also geopolitical concerns when we kind of start to move from looking within Europe and at the European market at kind of exporting these ideas to the global level.
Thank you so much, Julia. So in a way, two main takeaways is number one, the United States has started regulating much more than they used to over the last couple of years. And number two, obviously the European Union has done the same, in a way pursuing a relatively different approach. Let's call it, more values-driven in a way, right? Now, what about the tech industry and, its own approach to economic governance and digital sovereignty? So what do you think is the technology industry seeking with respect to digital tech regulation and governance, and does this square with the approaches taken by the United States as well as the European Union, considering obviously such frameworks as the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act with its very large online platform regulation, including Google search? Danielle, can I come to you on this?
Sure, and again, thank you for sponsoring this really interesting conversation. It's great to be able to have this moment to step back and think about it as a practitioner thinking about it in the real world. I will say certainly Google has a vested interest in responsible innovation here, not just because we think it's a comparative advantage, right? People certainly will not buy into the promise of AI and other technologies without trust and understanding that it is being created in a way that is safe for users. I sit in our trust and safety organization where we have thousands of people who are focused on making sure we're thinking about some of the similar things that governments are thinking about in terms of human rights, in terms of safety of children, a host of those elements. So when you take it from that perspective, and also take to the fact that tech companies are really in a new space of regulation for them. It's not like healthcare or finance. Certainly in the past 10 years with GDPR, we have built the infrastructure for that, but fundamentally building a regulatory framework into the process of creating and iterating on products is something that we had built our own approach to, but harmonizing that with how governments think about that is something that we think about every day. So first of all, I think clear and predictable and hopefully interoperable or at least harmonizable ways of having those frameworks are critically important. That's true for large multinational tech companies such as Google. Certainly, we want to comply with all laws in every country that we operate in, but that certainly orders of magnitude more complexity as countries individually assert their right to govern and to regulate in the space. So we are consistently thinking about what are those best practices that will underlie the concerns across those companies so that we can do that in a more effective and efficient way. But certainly, if it's hard for a company like Google, it's definitely hard for a company like a startup or another organization. I would certainly say a risk-based and really context-specific approach is also important here. So if you think about the world that I'm in every day, where we're looking at, for example, maybe the turnaround times for seeing inappropriate content online, being able to either, we see something like that, we flag it and we take it down, but the person who posted it in the first place may have an objection to that. How do we quickly allow there to be appeals processes for that? How do you understand how to have a fair approach to adjudicating that? Those could be really prescriptive in some countries, very general in other countries, and they could just have specific timelines in certain places and a reasonableness standard in other places, right? And so trying to harmonize that when you have platforms that literally have billions of users on it is quite a challenge. And then I would say one of the things that I am personally invested in and my team, our global team works on is contributions and creation of multi-stakeholder processes here. When you think about something like seeing emerging risks in, say, human rights that may be developing on platforms or gender-based violence or even mis and disinformation, you need both an understanding of where that is coming from and civil society, academic, and other inputs. I think the DSA certainly contemplates that and the Digital Services Act in the way that they suggest that we get that feedback as we're trying to identify those risks and as we're trying to develop the mitigations. And then I think the United States and other places like that are thinking about this, but it's much more fragmented, certainly, and that presents a particular challenge for us as well.
Thank you, Danielle. Brian, what do you think about this question?
I like Danielle's word of harmonizable because I think that's when we talk to our clients in the tech sector, that's really one of the main things that large organizations have to deal with, both internationally, US, various European jurisdictions, Asia, but also here in the US. When you think about AI regulation, you've got, I don't know, 20 some odd states that are passing their own AI regulatory models here. And so I think that there's a desire to comply and to be responsible, but there's also a desire to have rules that actually can be implemented across an organization that I think is really important. Along those lines, I think the U.S. approach to some of the export control issues, I think is going to prove to be somewhat challenging in this regard. You know, traditionally, export controls, at least among the West, have been coordinated both for national security reasons and for commercial reasons. You don't want to give your competitor in France an ability to sell something that you can't sell in Canada or the United States. The Trump administration has suggested they don't want to coordinate on export controls anymore with other countries. And I think that's going to put the tech industry in the US in particular in a bit of a bind, you know, complying with US law, supporting the US government, while also trying to figure out what to do if your competitors around the world are not subject to the same rules.
Thank you so much, Brian. Now, we've covered the first part of our conversation, which was supposed to be on regulatory models, the different models that there are out there. Obviously, we didn't cover them all, but now moving on to the second round of questions for our panelists, we're moving on to the question of the potential of convergence across the models. And there's one model that we didn't particularly cover, but we should, that is China. So, Mark, a question for you, if I may. Are there any areas of potential cooperation between the United States and China in regulating emerging technologies? Or is this competition without any obvious areas for collaboration? Or are there any particular technologies in which the two countries could possibly work together on?
Thanks, George, for that question. Let me just take a minute just to paint how China is a different actor compared to the other actors in the space. On the one hand, you can look out and say China has a set of commercial actors that are building out the same technologies, competing in the same type of markets, looking to innovate in the same emerging technologies. But when you take a step back and you look at the political economy under which those commercial actors are operating, and then you look at the regulatory landscape, and particularly when you look at the intersection between the party, the state, and then these commercial actors, you see they're operating in a very different space. And I haven't even gotten to the technical part in terms of how the technical stack is actually then managed in China and how that's different than the rest of the world. So with that backdrop, right, the question that, George, I think you're really asking is, can you have convergence when you have major actors that are operating in such different ways? And so I want to unpack your question a little bit. I think at the state-to-state level, where you're thinking about the U.S. and China cooperating, even in the midst of the Cold War, there was some discussion between the Soviet Union and the United States, but these were confined largely to safety issues. So I think in this domain, right, the U.S. and China, despite being embroiled in a strategic competition with each other, there will be some discussions and possibly possible cooperation, but at least discussions on safety issues. And I think we saw that in the Biden administration with the dialogue that began on AI safety issues. I think the other area where there could be some discussion are areas where there is very little of what is considered dual-use technologies and where the gains to cooperation would be very, very high. But increasingly, more and more technology falls into that dual-use category. And so that's the second category that I draw your attention to. But I want to then unpack that question to say there's a difference, as you began, right, in terms of there's a state-to-state model, but then there's also what happens at the firm level and what happens on an individual actor level. Right. And so I think at the firm level, there is going to be much more, at least a discussion on issues that touch at what, Danielle and Brian just raised on harmonization, or at least harmonizable, thinking about engaging in the same standard-setting bodies, thinking about ways in which you can promote interoperability even amongst competing emerging technologies. So I think to the extent that there's going to be an attempt to seek cooperation, if not convergence, increasingly that's going to take the form of non-state actors, particularly commercial actors.
Thank you so much, Mark. Now let's try to address the point of potential convergence between the European Union and the United States. And all of us, that participate in conferences on digital governance, digital regulation, and so on, we all know that the European Union is very often criticized, about having gone a little too far when it comes to regulating the digital economy, the digital world. Now, one of the most recent critiques came from Vice President Vance, maybe at a level that, people in the European Union were not really expecting. Namely, the EU measures were criticized, especially on platform governance by Vice President Vance, as interfering with individual and democratic rights, such as, the freedom of expression. Now, Julia, allow me to ask you about the EU's approach to protecting digital users' rights and human rights. Is the European Union potentially going to back down on them in the face of current geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions?
Well, as you say it, I think surprised was a mix of being surprised and amused, I think, in some way, about this kind of criticism. We are very used to getting this criticism about regulation being harmful to innovation, so on. I think what the response will be is certainly not to back down, especially not when it comes to the protection of human rights and user rights through digital regulation. I think what we kind of have to understand is really what these last bunch of regulation that we have, starting from the GDPR and now to the AI Act, they really have at the heart this idea that we need this kind of human-centered and value-based regulatory approach. And so what the EU is trying with this regulation is kind of really to find a middle way between the US. They actually say this. They really try to find the European third way, to define the European third way between this US economy-driven liberal model, mostly based on self-regulation, and the more restrictive China-driven model of digital authoritarianism. So they kind of try to find a way in which the state, as a regulator, plays a much stronger role, and the rule of law plays a much stronger role, but not going so far as would go like China and other countries. And I think what they really mean is they really try to put the idea of the protection of user rights also at the heart of these regulations. At least that's what they say, and that's how they also how the European Commission is also really kind of justifying these regulations. Of course, there are the economic concerns behind them, but it's also mostly about justifying them that way. And if you take, I think a lot have been said about the data protection regulation, but if you look at the Digital Services Act, for example, this is really about one part is really about kind of providing effective safeguards for users, including the possibility, for example, to challenge platform content moderation decisions, what we just heard, as well as is one of the issues Google is concerned with. And it's also really obliging corporations to provide ways in which citizens can notify illegal content, including also notifying illegal products. Also that kind of creating ways that there is more transparency on advertising, so that users really have a way to know what kind of information is used, and why they see certain ads and why they are targeted by certain ads. And also, I think that's what's the interesting part is also that users can seek compensation from providers of platforms. For any damages they kind of suffer if they don't kind of oblige with these rules. So I think there you can really see that they put this kind of ideas of user rights, democratic rights, including also freedom of expression, because you can challenge decisions and so on, at the heart of the regulation. So I think it's interesting to receive the criticism that this is actually one of the problems. But I think what kind of looking at it more broadly, you can really see that there is clearly a shift in the European kind of way to regulate the digital economy. And that is the shift from a very kind of liberal model in which we trusted the market to solve these issues of human rights and user rights, to the idea that we actually need the state, the democratic elected governments, to do this for us and to oblige these countries to actually think about this and to do this. So in some way, there is this kind of very clear shift, which is a shift not only in the digital sphere. I mean, it's a shift in the European kind of union that you see more generally, right? But it's also in some way a shift away from these original cyber libertarian ideas that we had and that still underlie the global governance system that we have for the internet and that are still very present. Also, we see it's also changing in the US towards a different kind of model of the digital economy and the digital transformation in more general. So it's kind of an indicator of this shift and this shift that we think that we need regulation to protect the liberal ideas that form the basis for the internet. So that's really kind of a change to what you look 20 years ago.
Thank you so much, Julia. In fact, the more traditional, let's say, criticism against the European Union regulating was that, it is going too far, right? The regulatory approach, takes, it has an extraterritorial effect, which impacts companies not only within the European Union, but outside the European Union as well. And companies such as Google, are trying to navigate, through the rough waters of, regulation because, they have to comply with the European Union regulatory measures, as well as with the regulatory measures newly, more recently in the United States, but also other countries, right, that are mimicking the same approach, such as India, for example. Now, has this whole landscape, Danielle, led to the world, let's say, different domestic regulations mimicking the approaches of the European Union? And do companies such as Google actually, de facto as well as de jure, are obliged to follow the approach of the European Union?
It's a good question. And just to bring this home, you can imagine the surprise of many at Google, not just those who are in governments, when we are asked whether or not we perceive the Digital Services Act to be inherently contradictory to ideas of freedom of speech in the United States, and would that be jeopardizing our U.S. users vis-a-vis those rights. That is well beyond the scope of anything that a company wants to be able to adjudicate, and it's not just esoteric. It's actually coming to the fore. Of course, we would love to continue to do things like share our thoughts and perspectives with those in the U.S. and those in the EU and other countries, and so we do that. And so I think Mark's point about this convergence happening in the private sector is happening, frankly, out of necessity, and so those multi-stakeholder opportunities are really great. But your question was about how other countries and developing countries might be left out of this conversation. I do think that is a potential risk. Certainly, we try specifically to bring voices into those conversations so we can understand how to mitigate risk for all users. So, for example, we're having an AI summit next week in Brazil, where we're bringing civil society groups, academics, governments together in the region. In Spanish and Portuguese, to talk about the opportunity economically that AI brings, but also to get their perspective on how we do things like model cards, which is a way that we talk about a transparency mechanism to understand what a model's capability are what they're trained on, et cetera. Does that work for Brazil? Does it not? Right? Those are exactly the kind of things that we're interested in. We are hoping to be a catalyst for sharing that information, but certainly if there is not, I think, an intentional opportunity, or we're not able to leverage those multi-stakeholder opportunities, that could be something that's lost.
Thank you, Danielle. And let's build a little on this point. Namely, we've covered very extensively, obviously, the United States. We've covered very extensively the European Union. We've covered some of the aspects that pertain to what the digital giants want. But there's one point that Danielle started covering, namely developing countries, right? So, and let me go to Mark, if I may, and ask about developing nations and how do they navigate between those competing regulatory models, mostly from the United States, the European Union, as well as China. There is obviously a risk of digital dependency, right, as well as marginalization. Mark, would you like to cover this point?
Yeah, so I'll build on what Danielle raised. I think first thing just to recognize is, we always lump developing countries into sort of this one category, but there's actually quite a bit of heterogeneity across them. So I think this question is really different if you're a large developing country like Brazil, as Danielle referred to, or especially India, which has been emphasizing its own form of digital sovereignty. Any large developing country with scale is going to assert its own self-interest in this space. It has these different models from which to pick and choose from. I think if you're a smaller developing country, then you're being very pragmatic here. You're looking, first of all, as to where are your users and where in particular are your firms most interconnected, independent when it comes to these different regulatory models. And that's going to shape the type of governance structure to which you're going to align. But you're also, to use the buzzword that we've been discussing, wanting to make sure that you're interoperable with the other markets as well. So I think the situation really does differ. I think it also differs on what type of technology we're talking about when it comes to the core technologies that are going to sort of be at the heart of all this. These choke point technologies, are, because they require scale, are likely to develop in these large economies that also have the capital and the long-term investment horizon, not to mention a security element by which to invest in this. But if you look at other elements of this, and I think Danielle also referred to this in her answer, that need to be tweaked for a local market and so forth, then you also have regional players that may be able to shape those norms within their given region. So you think about Nigeria within parts of Africa and so forth. So I think the answer really differs depending on what type of developing country we're talking about.
Thank you, Mark. This is really insightful, right? The extent, how extensive the market is, will eventually, in a way, determine the position of the relevant country, right? Absolutely. So we've covered a lot on, in a way, the status quo. Let us start thinking a little bit about the future as well as obviously the position of international law in this whole conversation and debate. And I have a question for the whole panel, namely, what are the realistic prospects for international cooperation on digital governance? So we've seen certain, efforts on behalf of international law to react, right, take over to some extent some of the things that have been happening at the domestic level or at the private level. But what do you think about the future? Will it be mostly political fora that will be in charge of digital governance, or taking the responsibility for digital governance? Traditional multilateral fora. What about the World Trade Organization, for example? Plurilateral arrangements, such as the Agreement on Electronic Commerce that arose July of last year, or I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, efforts at the level of the United Nations. To, in a way, try to take the lead in regulating the digital economy and digital technologies, or other alternatives that such as multi-stakeholder initiatives, maybe that potentially might arise, bringing together all those actors. Shall we start with Brian, who haven't heard from you for a while?
Sure. Yeah. I can't paint an overly optimistic answer to your question, George. I think, particularly from the U.S. perspective, multilateralism almost seems like a dirty word right now under the U.S. government. When I think about where it's realistic for the U.S. government and U.S. firms to interact multilaterally, I kind of think about a couple of different areas. One is, and I think Danielle may have mentioned this, standard-setting organizations, which is really driven by industry as much as states. But that's an area where the U.S. government has traditionally played a role. Industry has is incentivized to continue to show leadership and participation in those spaces. It's an area where the U.S. and China have continued to cooperate. And so to see where international standard-setting organizations go in some of the spaces we've been talking about, as a technical matter and as a substantive kind of policy matter, I think that's one space to watch. Another is think about some of the multilateral treaties that are already in place where there are implications for some of the issues that we've been talking about. The Chemical and Biological Weapons Convention, for example. If bad actors are using large AI models to develop chemical weapons? What are the responsibilities of states to police those? What are the responsibilities of big tech companies to police that activity? Who will have liability as a civil and criminal matter? These are issues that are already covered in multilateral treaties, and I think that's an area where you may see states at least need to converge or at least discuss how to think about some of those approaches moving forward.
Thank you so much, Brian. Mark?
I'll toss two quick thoughts out here, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists. So the two words that I want to respond with are, on the one hand, fragmentation. I think we're unlikely to see large-scale multilateral declarations. If you look like something like the Bletchley Declaration, it's largely setting out a set of principles, but the actual work is going to be done in these fragmented elements. And even at a place like the WTO with the Joint Statement Initiative, that's a fragmented plurilateral approach.
Right.
So that's the first word that I want to toss out. I think the other force at work possibly here, and we've really seen this get amped up over the last couple of weeks, is thinking about linkages, because these emerging technologies, as I mentioned, have both security and economic dimensions. And the question that's really going to come to the fore is whether or not these geopolitical rivals are going to link them with other dimensions. That traditionally has not been the case. These have been kind of standalone areas. They sometimes are even modular. You can pick and choose. But I think the open question for us to consider is whether that era is going to change and whether or not there are going to be increasingly more linkages placed between this area and other areas of shaping of international law.
In a way, the point that you made before as well about the interoperability, right? And Danielle made as well. So let's, move to Germany for a couple of minutes. And by the way, we're going to have time for questions at the end of, our conversation here with our panelists. So, please do prepare if you like.
But every panel I've been to has left about 30 seconds for questions.
No, in fact, we're going to have around 10. Don't worry.
We'll leave at least 45 seconds.
Thanks.
So allow us another, 5-6 minutes or so, if we may, okay? So, Julia?
Yeah, sorry, I had a short interruption in my connection, and I can hear you. We are still with the same question. I didn't hear the last couple of minutes you said, but if it's still about the kind of future of global cooperation.
Right, yes, this is it.
Yes, I actually had the very same ideas that Mark just put out there. So I think, well, first of all, I think we need to kind of also see what actually do we mean with digital governance, right? Because there are different levels of digital governance. And I think if we look at the kind of original internet governance idea, really kind of the cooperation that we need to get our digital infrastructures running and keep them interoperably across the world, I think I don't expect that we will move from the multi-stakeholder model in the very near future, because we simply needed to have to keep this connection running. So this is, I think, one of the bases. But then you look at other level of digital governance, and I think digital governance is becoming bigger every day, and there are like new themes coming up and new technologies emerging and other new fora. So we will see a very fragmented space there. I'm absolutely agree with Mark on this point. So we will see a fragmented space kind of geographically, in the sense that we will see that we actually have to realize that there are geographical borders even within our digital spaces, and we will see a fragmented kind of regulatory space across the world with different regulations and unregulated spaces in between. So we will see definitely there, but we'll also see a fragmentation of the governance structures. So we'll have probably for some areas much more bilateral or interregional agreements, and we'll have other areas where maybe we will come back to some sort of international a law based on international organizations. Also, I'm very pessimistic about this at the very moment, but I mean, things can change, hopefully. So I think we will see a fragmentation in any sense of this. But I think what the really what we need to realize is that many of these governance models we developed for the internet and for the digitalization in general were really based on this idea that within the digital space, we don't have geographical kind of boundaries. And that's why we need international cooperation. And I think this kind of idea has been proven to be wrong in the last couple of years or even decades, because actually it was never this open and free internet with a completely cross-border data flow was always just an idea. It was actually never reality. And I think this is something that became clear. And now we kind of need to build around this and develop new ideas of cooperation that actually take into account these digital boundaries and also the ambition of states to play a more important role in this.
Right. Thank you so much, Julia. And Danielle?
I don't know if there are any techno-optimists anymore, but
There must be some.
somewhere. I would like to be. I think one way to think about it is what is lost if fragmentation rules the day, or we don't find ways to really understand how harmonizability can happen. Right. The promise of AI is something that I think is incredible. It's not just an innovation; it is the way to innovate. Right? It is a fundamental tool that has the potential, if you're a model developer or deployer at various levels of the stack, to really transform the way that economies work. And so there is just going to be huge amounts of unlock that don't happen if there is too much fragmentation, if we can't really get our minds around how to thoughtfully regulate this space, taking into account societal harms in a pragmatic way, taking into account a risk-based approach that is based in reality, we really will, as a society, as a broad society, lose those benefits. I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see how incredible a lot of these technologies are and the opportunity is, and that will drive us to anchor those solutions. But I guess we'll see.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So we have roughly 12, 13 minutes for questions. We have one mic in the front and one mic in the back. Feel free to pose your questions here. We already have one. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. I'm Nick Rostow. I used to work in the intelligence and national security world and do a lot in cybersecurity. I wasn't planning on asking a question, but I'm prompted to because I got a notice on my computer that as of October, Microsoft was not going to provide updates and security patches to Windows 10. Now, something like 80 to 90% of ATM machines in the world use Windows XP. There's, just about everybody in this room probably has a cell phone. All the apps use open code, open source operating systems, which can be basically, if you have more technological skill than I do, you can get in there and do whatever you want to them. So my question is, should, say, the US government, Congress, pass a law requiring that if Microsoft produces an operating system, it has to, until there are no more such operating systems in the world, same goes for Google, it has to provide security patches forever. Second question, since you're dealing with governance, is there's this whole phenomenon of hackers in residence and exploits that are put into computers. What do we do about that? I mean, governments irresistibly use them for covert operations of all kinds, and nobody's thinking about consequences of creating precedents, and I wonder if you all have given any thought to any of these issues. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Thank you so much for the questions. So we have the questions, in fact, two very thoughtful questions. Number one, on the role of the state, right, in supporting customers whose technology, is bygone, right? Should there be any role for the state in intervening there? And number two, about state-backed hacking, right? A very big question, and about the potential role of international law. There you go. This might be an area for cooperation amongst the states, at least for some of them. Anyone would like to take the question? Should we, Brian, would you like to start?
Sure. So I think on the first question, I think if the Congress were to pass a law, that'd be a very popular law. I'm sure there's many people in your shoes who say, well, what do? I don't want to buy a new computer or cell phone or whatever the device may be. So I don't know. I'm skeptical that'll happen, but in a more serious tone, you think about other technologies and something that becomes more of almost a utility that in the U.S. and elsewhere, national governments have taken a role in saying you have a responsibility to maintain this service because people rely on it. So possible and interesting. I kind of think Microsoft may, play a game of chicken and come out and start continuing to support the Windows 10 longer than they're saying they're going to. But I don't really know. I think on the second topic, the state hacking and cooperation in that regard, I think that there is some cooperation that goes on in that space. Amongst allies, at least, but there's also competition, kind of like the commercial issues we've been talking about. I'm not sure I see that as an area that lends itself easily to multilateralism or broader cooperation. In the commercial space, kind of similar to that, one thing that I see that's kind of interesting where you have adversaries in some ways cooperating is companies that are in place in Europe and the U.S. who are basically putting hackers out whose job it is to try to find holes in commercial products. And often the people who are best at finding holes are from places like Iran and China, North Korea. And that's an area in the U.S. where the U.S. government has actually been somewhat supportive of allowing companies to hire hackers from other places to help them identify vulnerabilities. So that's not exactly the question you were asking, but I think that's an example of where kind of commercial necessities can sometimes overcome political boundaries in some ways.
Julia, would you like to? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I think it's a very interesting question. I'm referring to the first one because I think it shows, maybe I'm too European in my mind, but it actually shows to me a very different problem. The problem is not Microsoft not providing its security badges, but the problem is actually that we are so dependent on this one company and we don't have a choice but to ask this company to continue its system, right? So, I mean, I always forget the exact number, but I think something about 70% of European administration runs on Microsoft, right? So what happens if in some point in time, and I mean, this is becoming less and less kind of a complete vague idea, there might be tensions between Europe and the US, and we can't trust these Microsoft systems anymore, but we don't have at the moment another solution and we don't have an alternative. And I think that's the real problem. And that's actually the problem if you come back to the title of this session. That's what is at the heart of the digital sovereignty debate, is that we need alternatives, that we need choice, and that we need to control the systems that actually are kind of like running the most critical infrastructures of all different spheres of life. So can it be from ATM to all our kind of administration? And so I think what we actually need is governments to develop strategies how we get users and companies out of these very strong dependencies and that we give them possibilities. And I also agree with you here that open source and open source solutions are one of the ways out there. But it needs money and it needs also political will to actually make this step.
Thank you, Julia. Maybe Mark and Danielle might want to respond to the first two questions in a bit, but we have another two questions. Allow me to collect them. Please, in the front.
Hi, my name is Ishu Liu. I'm a lawyer at the World Bank. Thank you so much for a fruitful discussion. And then I find it really intriguing about the non-state actors' participation when it comes to the digital governance. So apparently, I think it's already emerging, as in there are so many actors, the UN, the World Bank, IMF, and then many civil associations are trying to come up to a standard or like a suggestion of regulating the digital world. So apparently there's also a lot of concerns. I think we mentioned a little bit about the global north might be leading it. If the giant tech companies try to set a standard that's like profit-driven, and then also legitimacy, accountability, and a lot of overlapping and fragmented standards that are proposing. So my question is, what's your perspective on how should international law accommodate to this phenomenon already? And also, would you think it would be a universally applicable pattern for anything that might be emerging in the future? Because we're talking about technology, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we have another question in the back.
Hello, my name is Yichen Huang. I'm currently a research fellow at Georgetown Asian Law Center. And my question is that since fragmentation is inevitable in recent years, do you think that there will be signs of convergence in the post-Trump administration? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have 3.5 minutes. What I think is best to do is give the floor to our panelists, roughly for 30 plus seconds each, to respond to the question as well as potentially give a final account, or some final thoughts. Maybe we'll start with Julia.
I'm actually just the idea of a post-Trump convergence. So I think that is what the EU is trying to push, right? Is convergence and try to harmonize rules and within Europe, of course, but also increasingly, that's really the most recent move is to kind of trying to really actively get other countries, in particular in the global south, to follow the European example. If this will actually lead to convergence, or if this leads only to more geopolitical tensions between world regions who all compete over the influence in these countries, I think that's actually something that is not going to be decided in the realm of digital governance, but that's actually dependent on political constellations that we will see over the next decades. So I don't really have a very clear idea of what will happen because it depends on so many different factors that are beyond the field of digital governance.
Thank you, Julia. Danielle?
A lot of great questions. I think it's interesting because there's such a tension between having a system that can be transparent, understandable, interoperable, and one that is really driven by a multi-stakeholder approach, whether that be open source, for example, which allows you to be able to see those exploits and maybe identify those things and incentivize others to pay attention to them. One of the concepts I think is really useful here is to think about how can we make incremental steps to do things like signal share and information share. In my world, that would look like, for example, in scams or in terrorism, making it easier for companies or platforms, other organizations who might be seeing signs of these problems to share this information and to all sort of attack a problem that we think is mutually problematic. No government, organization, company, civil society group wants there to be terrorism on their platforms, right? So I think there are ways that we could come together and have really practical solutions and maybe make our way as we go to the more complex geopolitical questions that we are thinking of today.
Thank you, Daniel. And Mark?
Just very quickly, I think on the question of openness and also convergence, we're still in the very early stages of a very exciting technological revolution where innovation is going to be critical, and the ability to both tap into those ideas but play into an open ecosystem is going to be important. But there are going to be guardrails on that due to security and due to thinking about how do you preserve your innovation edge. So just a quick answer to that question. On the convergence question, I think I'm focused less on thinking about convergence and just thinking about actually how do we use law, not necessarily even international law, possibly just transnational law, to foster some degree of interoperability, to have the pragmatic ability to draw on that scale, to take advantage of the innovation that's ahead of us.
Thank you, Mark. And Brian?
I think that international coordination is inevitable in this space. I think that's a good thing. I don't think any one government or one administration can stop that. And I think innovation in terms of coordination is what we should be thinking about. International law has already been innovating away from a reliance on multilateral treaties to things like non-binding statements that are easier for states to sign up to, if you will. I think transnational law is another area, private international law, where you have companies that need to have standards they can agree to. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if some channels are cut off, the traditional UN statements. Where do states and other actors go to find the coordination that I think is essential here?
As anticipated, we have had a fantastic panel, really. But before inviting you to join me in thanking our panelists, I would like to tell you that if you signed up to receive CLE credit for the session, your code word is GOAT, right? So thank you so much to our panelists. Please do join me in thanking them. Thank you so much.